Hey everybody. 3 days ago, on Friday, July 28th, Brian Holdsworth released a video called A Question Atheists Can't Answer. I would like to take a stab at answering that question. I generally don't do the whole response video thing on my channel. I did reach out to Brian, just saying, hey Brian, I often call myself the closest thing to an empiricist without literally being an empiricist, so even though I call myself agnostic, not atheist, I think that I fit the demographic that you're trying to reach with this video. I'd like to make a response to it, and I'd prefer to speak to you directly. But if you just don't see this email, or if you don't respond, I will go ahead and make a response video. But I did this because I like to speak to people face to face. I think that's a much more productive method of figuring out what each other are trying to say. But it's been 3 days, and Brian hasn't responded to my email yet. Before you say, of course, Brian didn't respond. You know, he's so much bigger than you. Brian is actually, like, he's answered my emails before. So I didn't think it was, like, crazy for me to reach out to Brian about this. And even if it was crazy, I probably would have done it anyway, just because I think it's the principle of it. So clearly I recorded this around 2 weeks ago, and this video is only just coming out now. There's a reason for that. Brian did respond. We had a back and forth, and I am going to include a dramatic retelling of that back and forth after I go through my full review of his video. If you're only interested in my back and forth with Brian, go ahead and skip to the chapter that is appropriately labeled. It should be in the description down below. I'm going to do your typical response video to Brian Holdsworth, A Question Atheists Can't Answer. Like I said, even though I don't call myself an atheist, I think that I fit the demographic close enough. And I don't think Brian and I are going to necessarily do a whole lot of disagreeing. I think that I'll just be offering a different perspective on the question that Brian may not have considered. Brian may think that he's presenting bullets that are unbiteable, and I think we're going to watch the video. I'm going to bite a couple bullets, and that's going to be the end of it. So without any further ado, let's jump into it.
Okay, obviously, atheists come in all shapes and sizes, and inevitably, whenever I offer any kind of argument about atheism or against atheism, people will say, not all atheists believe that, not all atheists believe the same thing.
And I try to do the same thing whenever I talk about Catholics. I'll try to say something to the effect of, like, hashtag not all trads. That's something that I say a lot, is hashtag not all trads. But even then, I have an easier job in the sense that the Catholic Church has official positions that I can, like, look up and, like, answer. Brian doesn't have that luxury. But I think he does a pretty good job at explaining who his target audience is in the intro to this video. So I'm going to let him keep going.
That's a straw man argument. And that's true, not all atheists believe the same thing. But a 10-minute YouTube video doesn't allow me to address every variation of atheism that exists.
Brian, a 10-minute YouTube video doesn't let me address all of the different variations of Catholicism that exist, and Catholicism is, like, a much more narrow field than atheism. So that point is, like, very well understood. And like I said, I think Brian actually does a very good job at kind of qualifying who his target audience here is at the beginning. So starting off with a point of agreement, Brian, yeah, you're right that it would be impossible to fit a critique that would address literally every single atheist into a 10-minute YouTube video. So
Nor is it my goal to refute every instance of that common creed. Instead, I'm simply trying to address people who subscribe to a popular form of atheism, especially a kind that I interact with a lot on YouTube and that I see on certain channels.
So there's no way that Brian is talking about me. Although Brian and I have spoken before, just not like, so we have spoken even over video. It's not on YouTube. And we've spoken over text, like, back and forth. I don't mean, he doesn't, we don't have each other's phone numbers, but he's commented on my videos before. I've commented on his videos, things like that. But I don't think Brian's talking about me here. But I essentially fit the bill for what Brian's talking about here, even though I don't call myself an atheist. So with all that being said, Brian's going to get into it.
And to invite them to reconsider the logical coherence of their position.
reconsider the logical coherence. Brian is going to make a case that is going to result in somebody having to bite a bullet. And then if they don't bite the bullet, I actually kind of agree with Brian that some people are trying to like have their cake and eat it too. I don't though. I kind of just bite the bullet. And so Brian might actually agree that my stance isn't incoherent. At least I hope he would agree. I like Brian. I think he's a smart guy. And so, hey, if he thought that I was coherent, that'd make me happy.
And if what I described doesn't align with your particular form of atheism, then you can be confident that I'm not addressing you.
Again, not an atheist, but Brian's critique does address my form of agnosticism. So he is addressing me, more or less, even though I don't call myself an atheist. He still is addressing me. I think the critique is fair.
And then, therefore, there's no need to be defensive.
And I hope I'm not being defensive. I do my best to separate like the idea from the person. You know what I mean? Even ideas that I hold myself, I try not to be like married to like any of my ideas. So like if somebody critiques my, pick your position, right? If somebody wants to critique my mereological nihilism, I do my best not to take any of that personally. And I think I do a good job with that. Admittedly, I think it's a lot more difficult for people who kind of tie up their whole personality in a certain philosophical position. For some people, that is atheism. Like some people's whole personality is atheism. For some people, that's religion. Like some people's whole personality is their religion. So when you are critiquing like some of the philosophical suppositions that their religion entails, they feel like you're insulting them instead of just critiquing their religion. I don't get the feeling that Brian feels like that because Brian responds to like critiques of Catholicism all the time and he never seems to take it like super personally. I think I do a good job with that. And I don't think I'm going to take anything that Brian says here personally. In fact, I wind up agreeing a lot with Brian. So,
particular kind of atheism that I'm addressing in this video is the kind that says that only what can be materially observed and empirically measured is real, and that if you want to assert anything as true, that is the kind of evidence that you need to provide.
So this is a certain thought that's called empiricism. I am about as close as you can get to an empiricist without literally being an empiricist. And what do I mean by that? All that I mean is that I accept the logical laws, and I don't think that you can empirically verify the logical laws. You can test them and you can see that they hold every single time that you measure them. But that's not exactly the same thing. And frankly, like a lot of empiricism kind of like relies on the logical laws. So I accept the logical laws kind of just axiomatically. And I do so as a matter of convenience, if I'm being frank. And I kind of just accept them brutally. And other than that, though, I'm pretty much an empiricist, which is why I'm saying that Brian's critique of, well, we'll get into it, but I think that his critique applies to me because I am, for all intents and purposes, exactly what Brian just described. Somebody who says that, like, for the vast majority of beliefs that somebody could possibly hold, the only good reason to actually hold that belief is for empirical reasons. There are exceptions, which is why I don't call myself literally an empiricist, but I think that there are so few exceptions to that I'm as close to being an empiricist as you can possibly be without actually being one.
And it's on those kinds of grounds that they accuse religious believers of being superstitious for not being able to provide empirical evidence for our religious claims.
I am not somebody who generally refers to people as being superstitious just for holding beliefs that aren't empirically verified. Like, I don't think, so I'm a nominalist, but I don't think that realists are superstitious because there are atheists who hold to some kind of like Platonic realism. And I'm not calling these atheists who hold to Platonic realism superstitious. Likewise, I'm not going to call a Catholic superstitious just because the Catholic kind of holds to some form of realism that entails the existence of non-empirically verifiable things such as souls or perhaps a god. Superstitious is a word that might apply to certain practices. I've critiqued it before on my channel where I'll critique like the burying of St. Joseph statue to like make your house sell faster. I think that the word superstitious might apply there. But just simply holding, really, I think superstitious kind of only holds for things that can be empirically verified and either just haven't been or have been falsified, but people still believe them anyway.
So it's this kind of atheist that I address this question to,
And I'm an agnostic, but that applies to me.
because I just don't think that they can answer it. I've done a lot of searching myself to see, are there atheists out there? Are there commentators? Are there even scholars who answer this? And I don't seem to be able to find one that is satisfying.
I am going to suggest somebody at the end of this video who I think does do a good job at explaining what Brian is getting at, but he hasn't actually gotten to his critique yet, so let me stop interrupting him.
The question is slavery wrong? And the reason I ask that question is because virtually all respectable people will frantically trip over themselves to be the first to affirm that, yeah, it's wrong. Slavery is definitely wrong.
I'm only going to interrupt here to say that Brian's real point here is not about slavery per se. It's about moral realism, and he's going to get there. So don't go thinking that this whole thing is about slavery. I do have one point about slavery in particular that I'm going to address, because I actually don't think that Catholics can say that slavery per se is wrong. But I'll get there in a second. Let me just let Brian finish this point.
And I even hear many atheists accuse the Bible of being morally inferior for not going far enough in its condemnations of slavery.
And my critique of the Catholic Church and slavery is that I think that the Catholic Church has more or less backed itself into a corner where it says that slavery per se is not immoral, as in owning people as property is not immoral. Mistreating your people property might be immoral, but just the plain old act of owning somebody as property per se is not immoral, per the Catholic Church, per the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, in some documents that they put out at the tail end of the 19th century. I have a whole video on that. I'll link to that in the description down below. But I think that the Catholic has to kind of tacitly admit that slavery per se is not wrong. Sure, mistreating your slave might be wrong, but I think that the Catholic is kind of forced to tacitly admit that slavery per se is not wrong. I might have to tacitly admit that same thing. Let's see what Brian says.
But I don't think that the atheist of the variety that I described earlier can answer this question sufficiently. By that, I don't mean that they don't have answers, just that their answers are illogical, and that...
So I don't think that their answers are illogical. I think that there's like a semantic problem going on here, and you'll see what that semantic problem is in a moment.
They expose an inconsistency in the kinds of evidence that they demand of others to account for their beliefs.
Again, I think that this inconsistency that Brian is pointing out is kind of a semantic thing. Let's hear what Brian has to say.
Because if you're going to logically account for the truth of a statement like slavery is wrong, you have to be able to define the terms of that statement.
Right. And I think a decent amount of the people that Brian is directing this critique at would kind of take like a reductionist view about morality. Like morality simply is about human well-being. And then I think that the semantic problem kind of disappears. But if, as Brian goes on to make a point later, morality and human well-being can't be reduced to the same thing, then we do have a legitimate problem here.
Slavery is easy enough to define, so I'm not going to spend any time on that. But the word wrong is one that I've never heard defined in a way that is consistent with atheism. Because if you're going to define something logically, you cannot include the thing that you're trying to define in your definition.
And I don't think that people do that when they say that morality simply is about human well-being. However, and Brian doesn't exactly get here in the video, I just see like no reason to make the argument that morality and human well-being are the exact same thing. And I think that the people who want to kind of hold on to their moral realism should probably come up with a new word that describes human well-being besides morality, strictly because morality is used in all these different ways. Like in particular, I'm thinking about things like divine command theory. And so if it kind of seems silly to me that some people say morality, and what they really mean is whatever God says, and then some other people say morality and they mean human well-being. Let's just pick new words. That's kind of where I'm at.
That would be circular reasoning and therefore fallacious.
It would be circular if people were using morality to define morality. I don't think that's what they're doing. I think that they're doing a reduction.
For example, if I asked you, what is a honeybee? And you said, well, it's a bee-like creature that makes honey. I would be fully within my rights to accuse you of failing to answer my question. All you said is that a bee is a bee.
Yeah, and no disagreement here. I don't think that's what a lot of moral realists do when they hold to this kind of like non-divine command theory.
And that's obvious enough. But what's also true is that we can't use undefined synonyms in our definitions of a thing either. So if you ask me, what is a cat? And I said, well, a cat is a feline creature that humans have a disordered amount of affection for. Well,
there's nothing disordered about the amount of affection that I feel towards my 4 cats, Brian. I'm taking that personally. This means war. I'm just kidding.
Feline is just a synonym for cat. So all I've said, again, is a cat, which does nothing to define what it is. It just keeps us going in circles. And unfortunately, every time I've heard an atheist give an account for morality, which then allows them to use words like right and wrong logically and coherently, this is the exact thing that they do. Like
some people try to be like, oh yeah, whatever's right is whatever is moral. Oh yeah, whatever's moral is whatever right. And like that, you're not getting anywhere when you say that. But again, I don't think that's actually what the target audience is doing.
Article I read said that morality is simply whatever prevents suffering and increases well-being. But all they've done, according to this definition, is made suffering synonymous with evil and well-being synonymous with goodness, never really defining any of them. And furthermore, they're not even accurate synonyms. Suffering isn't simply wrong or evil. In fact, I can think of all kinds of instances in which varying degrees of suffering can produce something that is widely considered good.
This is what Sam Harris talks about in The Moral Landscape when he talks about how like there's different like peaks in the mountain range of human well-being. And like suffering in the gym to like build stronger muscles is a form of suffering that will increase your well-being. But the kind of suffering that you're doing when you have, terminal cancer is not increasing your well-being. So there's types of suffering that do and types of suffering that do not increase your well-being. Agreed. I don't think that your target audience really disagrees with that point, Brian. And also, I don't think that this is circular. I don't think that people are saying, oh, well, suffering is just whatever is wrong, and whatever is wrong is suffering. That would be circular. I think that people are describing suffering as something like, the sensation that occurs when there's not enough serotonin in your brain. I don't actually know how the brain chemistry works. And then I think people are saying that, like, whatever is bad is whatever causes humans to suffer. So I don't think that that's actually circular in the way that you think it is. But I still kind of agree with you about other things.
Such as like chemotherapy or surgery. Exercise is almost universally recognized as a good thing in the right place and at the right time. But the first time I went running as a way to get back in shape, the experience was so unpleasant for me that I nearly threw up. Self-sacrifice and self-denial seem to me to be traits that most people recognize as being honorable, but almost always introduce a degree of suffering. We have monuments in virtually every city where I live commemorating those who died in the wars of the 20th century. So was it wrong for them to suffer and die for those causes? So it seems that not.
So I actually do think that a lot of people would say that like the fact that they had to suffer is wrong. Like it is a bad thing that people had, like, the Canadian soldiers were killed on the beaches of Normandy during World War II. It's a good thing that they went to Normandy because they prevented what could, I guess, have been like even a worse genocide than the genocide that did occur. But that they were to go die, I think most people would say was bad, and it would be better if they didn't have to go die in the first place. So
not only is morality and right and wrong not defined by that definition, the synonyms that they attempt to smuggle in as substitutes for the terms that they are trying to define in a circular way aren't even good synonyms. Many, many others have tried to argue that morality is simply what has been agreed upon as a social contract, which can accumulate into something like a legal system or the law.
Yeah, and I'm not a huge fan of this approach to morality, and that's why I'm an anti-realist. I think the social contracts exist. I just don't think that's what most people mean when they talk about morality.
But this begs for a definition of the social contract or the law. If you reply that the social contract is an agreement about what is right and wrong, then all you've done is made the social contract or the law synonymous with morality. And again, you're back to arguing in circles.
Yeah, so again, I don't think that people actually define social contracts strictly as like right and wrong. I think people would define social contracts as like, our shared expectations of each other. And so they would say something like, to violate our shared expectations of one another is immoral, and to uphold our shared social expectations of one another is moral. I think that's the argument they make. Again, I don't think that's what most people talk about when they talk about morality. So I just feel like it's like not a well-suited word for the task that we are trying to accomplish. But I don't think that this is circular. That's kind of my one disagreement with Brian.
If I ask you what is morality and you say that it's the social contract about what is right and wrong or the law, and I follow up by asking, okay, can you define what the law is? And you say it's a series of documented statements about what is right and wrong. Do you not see how we're just going in circles without ever defining any of the things that we're talking about?
And I would agree if somebody defined the law like that, but I don't think that most people who take this like social contract view of morality actually define laws as like arbitrating what is right and wrong. I think people define laws as agreements that we make with one another. And then there's just kind of this reductio, like this reduction of, hey, right and wrong really is just all about our expectations of one another. So not circular, reductionistic.
Furthermore, it fails to account how we can judge one instance of a social contract or a legal system against another. How can we say that the legal system that allows slavery are bad and the legal systems that prevent it are good unless morality somehow sits outside and above legal systems and social contracts?
And so this is kind of the whole reason why I made this response video, is because I agree with Brian here, where I don't think that everybody's talking about the same thing when they talk about morality. And that's why I try to just circumvent the whole semantic game just by calling myself a moral anti-realist. Like, I don't think that the people who have this divine command theory view of morality are talking about the same thing when they use the word morality as when somebody who has the social contract view of morality talks about morality. For that reason, I don't feel comfortable kind of like telling one group that they're right about what morality is and the other group about they're wrong about what morality is. So instead, I avoid the whole semantic game by simply saying, I don't know what morality is. I don't think it really exists. I do think that we have expectations of one another, and I do dislike it personally when people don't live up to my expectations of them, and I like it when they do live up to their expectations of one another. Similarly, I personally prefer it when humans flourish, and I disprefer it when humans don't flourish. Is that the same thing as morality? If and only if we reduce morality to those things, but again, most people don't seem to talk about morality that way. For that reason, I don't call myself a moral realist. If somebody did want to hold like a real robust moral realism, I think that Brian is right on the money here.
Because that's the question that's being asked here. Is slavery wrong? Are systems that allow slavery wrong?
Yeah, that's why I said the whole slavery thing is kind of neither here nor there, because the real point here is morality objective? And I think that the answer here, Brian is trying to address this at people who argue that morality is not objective. So then if morality is not objective, then you can't say that slavery is objectively immoral, because that would be an oxymoron. To which point I just say, yup, I don't say that slavery is immoral. What I do say, though, is that slavery is bad for human well-being. I choose to try to optimize human well-being wherever I can. I try to build societies with other people who want to optimize human well-being. And if you don't care about human well-being, I don't want to build a society with you. I said that whole little statement without referencing the word morality even once, because I don't really know what morality means.
I'm not asking, do some people create legal systems that outlaw it? Obviously, that's a question that doesn't need to be asked. The question is, ought it to be against the law for the sake of what is morally good?
And Brian just pulled out this huge word, ought, and I haven't solved the is ought problem. So I just don't say anything about what people ought to do, full stop. But I will talk about some kind of like goal oriented oughtness. So I will say that if people want to maximize human flourishing, they ought not institute slavery within their society. And I think that that's something that I can empirically back up. And so I think that's easy enough. But again, I haven't solved the is ought problem. And so if there is somebody who is trying to hold that there really is some objective ought, but they also hold a subjective morality, then that's super weird. And then I'm with Brian 100% in terms of like criticizing that position.
So again, not only is the social contract theory fallacious for using circular reasoning, it doesn't even use a well thought out substitute for morality. And the reason we always end up with these absurdities is because morality can't be accounted for empirically without obscuring it behind some poorly assessed substitute, which is by definition circular reasoning.
So that's not by definition circular reasoning, unless you're saying like morality is human well-being and human well-being is morality. But if you just add a third thing in there, like morality is just human well-being and human well-being is the flourishing of humans, which is a combination of like health and wealth and happiness. Okay, great. Not circular anymore. Again, that might not be what most people are talking about when they talk about morality. And like, I agree, and that's why I don't call myself a moral realist, which is why I'm kind of just okay biting the bullet and being like, yup, I can't say that slavery is objectively immoral. The best thing that I can do is say that slavery is opposed to the flourishing of humans, and I want humans to flourish, therefore I ought to, if I care about human flourishing, oppose slavery.
And which always offers a substitute that falls absurdly short of whatever it is that we mean by morality. So an atheist...
Well, I'm not sure that it always falls short of what we mean by morality, because some people have this reductionistic view of morality. But if you have some kind of like, metaphysically real sense of morality, and you try to shoehorn in this like social contract theory, then yes, it's going to fall short.
Can't actually say that anything by that measure is right or wrong and truly mean what they're saying without sacrificing their own logical consistency.
Which is exactly why I do not say, at least I try to be very careful with my language, though sometimes I do speak with the vulgar, but I try never to say that something is like moral or immoral. Sometimes I might use the words right and wrong, but right and wrong to me, generally I'm just talking about like human flourishing or something. Some people say that like right and wrong and moral and immoral mean the same thing. And sure, it's all semantics, and semantics bore the living daylights out of me. I'd rather not have like a whole semantic thing, and I'd rather just say, hey, look, I'm going to try to be precise with my language, and I'm going to try to say things like, is antagonistic to human flourishing or promotes human flourishing. And I'm going to try to avoid words like moral and immoral.
See, and don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that an atheist can't be moral or that they don't have a moral conscience. What I am saying is that they can't account for that morality logically. For them, it's something like social conditioning or just feelings about something. But whatever it is, it's not rational. Now, at this point...
Again, if Brian is trying to talk about this, like, metaphysically real morality, then I think I actually kind of agree with him. But again, I still think that there's like this semantic game going on, because I think that when most of these atheists are talking about morality being like hardwired into them, what they're really saying is, hey, we're a social species, and so it's hardwired into us that we want each other to succeed, because when my neighbors succeed, I succeed as well, because we are social primates.
And it might be fair to demand of me the thing that I've been asking atheists for, which is, what's my definition of morality? So morality is a standard of truth that gives us the ability to apprehend potential alternative thoughts, actions, and scenarios, and to make judgments about them that express either approval or disapproval when compared to that standard.
Yeah, and like, wouldn't that be awesome if we did kind of have this like real standard by which we could actually objectively say that things are right and wrong? Brian is essentially saying that like morality is somehow it's like a standard of truth, but like we can't measure this standard whatsoever. There's fairly wide disagreement both like temporally, like, right, like, we used to think slavery was fine and now we don't, but also just geographically, like, is it right or wrong to like let women vote? There's still countries where women can't vote, and they would think it would like be immoral to let women vote. So there's just widespread disagreement. So this standard of truth that we have doesn't seem to be very well distributed among the population. But wow, it would be cool if it was. And I think that like if we legitimately had like some way of empirically measuring this, or if morality was somehow just never changing throughout all of human history and didn't vary at all with geography and culture, I would probably give this argument a little bit more credence. But it does vary a lot over time and geography, so I don't give it a whole lot of credence, and I kind of just say I think it's all made up.
Such judgments appear in statements like, that ought to happen, and that ought not to happen.
Again, I don't make is ought statements because I haven't, I don't make pure ought statements because I haven't solved the is ought problem.
Or more precisely, that ought to be, and that ought not to be. In other words, we are making judgments of an ontological and metaphysical nature, which are inquiries about being and existence. These aren't questions about what does happen, they're questions about what ought to happen, because what ought to happen doesn't always happen. For example, slavery happens and is happening right now in the world around us. And if we say that's wrong, we're saying it ought not to happen.
Again, I haven't solved the is ought problem, so I don't talk like that. And if somebody did talk like that while holding to some kind of subjective morality, then that would be, I think that's a problem. So Brian and I mostly disagree here.
But if we only take our moral understanding from that which can be observed and measured empirically, then there is no question of what ought to be, only what is, because only what is what can be measured and inquired about in this way.
Agreed, and that's why I'm an empiricist, almost.
Which is why the physical sciences can't tell us that slavery is wrong. They can only tell us that it is, it exists, it has being.
Well, the sciences can do a lot more than just tell us that something is, right? Like, they could also, like, the physical sciences could also inform us about whether or not slavery causes health problems for slaves, whether it causes suffering in slaves, right? And these kinds of things would allow us to make judgments about whether or not slavery increases or decreases human flourishing.
But if you're saying it ought not to exist, then you're appealing to some invisible standard that can't be measured empirically, that is used to judge potentials like slavery or not slavery.
And if somebody did make that move, I would agree with Brian. I just don't think that most people make that move. Most of the people that Brian is directing this video towards, I think that they would agree that they haven't solved the is ought problem, and I think that they would say something to the effect of, if we want to maximize human flourishing, we ought not institute slavery. That's not a pure ought that is deriving an ought from an is, right? So, like, the goal is to maximize human flourishing, therefore we ought not institute slavery.
And saying that one should be willed and that the other should be opposed. One of those potentials, that is not slavery, should be instantiated by our will, and the other should be left on the shelf of mere potentials. And to make such statements, you have to offer evidence of a metaphysical and a theological nature, because there is no physical evidence available to you.
Agreed, that's why I'm an anti-realist.
Which is why it's no wonder that slavery, which virtually disappeared in Christendom in the Middle Ages, started to resurge in Western civilization at exactly the time when secularism started to gain momentum and influence. That is, the modern era.
Slavery did not disappear from the world. Slavery did not disappear from the world. Let's not get sidetracked.
The slave trade that we tend to think of and universally condemn really only got going during the scientific, secular, and Enlightenment era. In the ancient world, slavery abounded everywhere. The Roman Empire was built on the backs of slaves. And then in the Middle Ages, it went into severe decline. And in certain places where Christianity was dominant and the church was most influential, it virtually disappeared. But then for some reason, around the time of humanism, and then the Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment, it came back. It was exactly at this time.
I think it's pretty crazy to talk about, like, the 17th century as a time when, like, secularism abounded. The fact of the matter is that even to this day, the vast majority of people globally are theists. Christians still make up they're the most populous religion. So I don't think secularists have really ever been in power. like maybe today we're finally starting to get a foothold, but I think it's kind of crazy to say like, oh yeah, slavery, that was everybody knows the secular 17th century. I don't think that's quite right.
When we stopped measuring the human soul as an essential ingredient in a person's humanity and reduced that inquiry about what a human being is to only what can be physically measured, only what the sciences can tell us. And when they did that, they found that human beings are far from being equal. Some are bigger, some are stronger, some are smarter, some are more beautiful, some are more agreeable and more capable than others. Combine this with theories about natural selection and survival of the fittest, and you have the perfect recipe to say some people should dominate others and some people should be utterly subservient to others.
Natural selection, like as a theory, was not popular in the slightest until after Darwin. On the Origin of Species came out in the 1870s or something like that. The slave trade was Brian. The slave trade was almost over by then. Right? The American Civil War was fought in the 1860s or whatever, the 1850s and 60s or something. So slavery was illegal in the US, was made illegal in the US right around the same time that On the Origin of Species came out. I don't think that this timeline is quite right.
It is only when we account for the human soul, a thing more precious than the entire known universe, that we can then say that all men are equal, for they all carry the dignity of the divine image imprinted on that soul. And this is why it is an injustice to place a thing greater than the whole universe in service of cultivating the small contingent goods of that universe for another person.
And again, I'll just end here by saying that, like, I agree with Brian for a very specific target person. I just don't think that the vast majority of people who hold these views hold them in a way that is like Brian thinks that they hold it. I'm going to link below a video that I did about slavery in the Catholic Church, just because I think it's pertinent. And I do think that Catholics kind of have to tacitly admit that slavery per se is not wrong, which I think is kind of a funny position. Like, given Brian's, Brian could have picked really anything. Like, Brian could have been like, do you think that, like, murdering puppies is wrong? But anyway, that's it for this one. I hope that this was respectful, because I kind of hate the whole response culture. But I hope that this was respectful. Hope you liked it. And until next time. The email on the screen now is my second email to Brian. In my first email, I offered a conversation over the phone, over video call, something like that. Brian said he wasn't free to do that. He was a little busy, which I totally understand, but he did ask to hear my thoughts just in email form. So that is this email. I said, Brian, thanks so much for the response. My response to your video goes something like this. And then I laid out essentially what I just went over in the, preceding 30 minutes or whatever, just in a little bit less detail. But I think I did an all right job summarizing my position. Feel free to read what's on the screen. But now I'm actually going to hand it over to, like I said, Brian couldn't appear on video, but Brian's brother, Kevin Holdsworth, actually could appear on video, and Kevin was kind enough to narrate Brian's responses. Kevin Holdsworth, take it away. Thanks, Kevin. I'd say that well-being needs to be defined and accounted for in a logically consistent way. If well-being is synonymous for the good, then you haven't really defined what good is, and then fallen back into substituting terms without defining them, as I criticized in the video. I admit that theists can't really define goodness either, because goodness is partially a mystery, owing to it being tied to the nature of God, but that is consistent with belief in God, who is above and beyond our intellectual ability to define. It's inconsistent for the atheist to turn morality into some kind of mystery while still insisting that we need evidence of morality. That's obviously a double standard. Regarding your point about Catholics not being able to unequivocally condemn slavery as wrong, I agree. But that would obviously require some elaboration. Abduction and unjust confinement is absolutely wrong, but an economic arrangement between consenting adults which does not violate the dignity of either could be permissible. But what that looks like is hard to say. I'd be open to discussing the topic with you more at length, but I'm on the verge of launching a new business. I responded saying I'd certainly agree that human well-being should certainly be defined properly before we use that as a, quote, reduction in a reductionist view of morality. But I do believe that human well-being is fairly well understood right now. For instance, it's empirically verifiable that somebody's well-being is positively impacted by having a BMI of, say, 25, and one's well-being is negatively impacted by having a BMI of 50. I work in pharma, managing clinical trials, so I evaluate well-being for a living. Generally, we're looking at blood chemistry or measuring certain biomarkers, stuff like that. We understand that alanine aminotransferase, ALT, level that is outside of normal parameters indicates that your liver is messed up, either from alcoholism or from being severely overweight or something like that. All of this is reductionist, not circular. I do 100% agree, though, that if an atheist appeals to mystery about morality and isn't reductionistic about it, then yes, that atheist has a double standard. I'm glad that we agree that Catholics have to, quote, bite the bullet and admit that, quote, slavery per se isn't immoral, though slavery today might be immoral, kind of like the death penalty. It's totally cool that you're busy right now. I'll go ahead and make the video, but I'll present the arguments from this email chain so that the audience can get both sides of the coin. And I look forward to seeing whatever announcements might be coming to your channel soon. Exciting times. Thanks again for writing back. Your fan, Kevin. Thanks for the reply. I think you're taking too much for granted on the well-being question. You're taking things like physical health and equating it with well-being. But well-being is just a substitute for some measure of the good. But this takes for granted that health is a good thing. How do we know that? Even the phrase is begging questions. It assumes being itself is good, and that there is a kind of being that is good compared to a kind of being that is bad, perhaps sickness. But that's just avoiding the question. What does it mean to be well, and how does one do it? How does one become unwell, and why should we approve of one and disapprove of the other? That is what I argued in my video. You're simply substituting goodness for well-being, but never defining what goodness is or what evidence you have to call it such. What standards are we comparing it to? I agree that it is better to be than not to be, and that there is a way to be that is better, best, and perfect. But I can account for that because I recognize a true standard exists that gives us a way to judge the potentials. Pax Christi. Regarding Brian's statement saying, I think you're taking too much for granted on the well-being question, you taking things like physical health and equating it with well-being, I responded saying, so I don't actually know what non-physical health would look like. I certainly agree that brain chemistry is an important factor inside of well-being, and we wouldn't use ALT to measure that. We would use things like concentrations of dopamine in the brain. People with dangerously low levels of dopamine are diagnosed with depression. Same applies to serotonin. Obesity is linked to out-of-whack levels of leptin and ghrelin. But importantly, all of these mental health items are still physical. The scientific community is overwhelmingly not dualist about the mental and the physical. Regarding Brian's statement, but the well-being is just a substitute for some measure of the good, this takes for granted that health is a good thing. How do we know that? Even the phrase is begging the question. It assumes being itself is good, and that there is a kind of being that is good compared to a kind of being that is bad, perhaps sickness. And I responded saying, I'll have to disagree here. I don't think that, quote, the good needs to come into this equation at all. I think that lots of people reduce morality to human well-being. The good has nothing to do with this reductionist stance on morality. This whole time I've been playing devil's advocate since I'm not a moral realist myself, but here I will stop playing devil's advocate for a moment to say that I actually don't think that the word good makes sense without a qualifier, as in good for blank. Vomiting is good for blank. Sometimes, and it's not good for blank other times. So, for instance, vomiting is good for getting milk that's gone bad out of your stomach. But vomiting is not good for absorbing nutrients. But if I only asked you, is vomiting good? I think that you would rightly ask me, good for what? And I think that good is always like this. I reject the existence of a stance-independent good. Okay, back to devil's advocate for me. Brian said, how does one become unwell and why should we approve of one and disapprove of the other? And I say the atheist type who takes this reductionistic stance on morality wouldn't need to factor an approval or disapproval of human well-being into their stance on morality. They would simply say that morality is human well-being or something like that. So there doesn't need to be any approval of well-being in order to make empirical claims about well-being. And when I am making these claims about well-being, I'm actually making moral claims. Again, according to the atheist in this scenario, I do not actually hold this view. And one who becomes unwell when they have too much ghrelin in their brain, which causes them to gain weight, which causes stress on the liver and causes their ALT to spike. So, of course, there are tons of ways to be unwell, but there are empirical ways to determine this. Okay, I'll leave it there for now. Thanks. And this was actually the last response that Brian and I sent back to each other. It's been about a week without a response, and that's fine. It has to end somewhere, and I'm super grateful to Brian for even responding to these few emails. I'd love to talk to Brian more about this at some point, but for today, that is where our back and forth ends. And I almost forgot, I said at the beginning that I was going to leave some resources about moral realism. Dr. Lance Bush, I think, is an excellent resource on moral realism. Dr. Lance Bush has done appearances on multiple shows, Christian shows, as well as secular shows. In particular, on the screen now, you'll see his appearance on Kane B's show. I think that Lance Bush makes an excellent case for moral anti-realism, and I think that's a fantastic place to start. And in terms of papers, I'm going to link Gastronomic Realism. I think that's a very thought-provoking paper that might lead the moral realist to a position where they're either going to need to affirm gastronomic realism or deny both. Maybe. Read the paper and come to your own conclusion. Thanks, everybody.